Welcome to Meeting Minds Global, and good afternoon, morning or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. It's lovely to see so many of you. So thank you. So my name's Nicola. I'm the Alumni Relations Officer at Kellogg. And before I introduce you to our speaker for this session, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you can please all keep your microphones muted during the presentation, that would be very much appreciated, so there's no interference. There'll be a Q&A session after the presentation. If you can pop your questions in the chat box, that way we will hopefully not miss any, and we'll read them out at the end. And apologies if you can hear that in the background. My phone has just decided to start ringing. So my apologies for that. I also just want to mention that this session is being recorded. So if you want to keep your video feeds off for the duration, then that's absolutely fine. But just so that you're aware that it is being recorded. Right. Bear with me one moment. Right, everyone, my apologies for that. Back to where we were. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for the session this afternoon, Anna Beer. Anna is a visiting fellow at Kellogg, and she's also the author of a forthcoming biography, The Life of the Author William Shakespeare, in which she focuses on his working life as a poet, playwright, and actor. Pre-orders are open, so if you haven't pre-ordered yet, get in there. Anna is a cross-disciplinary author and researcher working in the fields of literature, history, and most recently music and creative writing. This is in fact Anna's 5th biography. Previous works include biographies of both Sir Walter Raleigh and Elizabeth, Lady Raleigh, his wife, the poet John Milton, and Sounds and Sweet Airs, the Forgotten Women of Classical Music, which spawned much media attention and coverage on TV and radio, including a documentary by BBC4 and 2 series commissioned by Classic FM. As if all of that wasn't enough, Anna's also on the advisory board of the Kellogg College Centre for Creative Writing and was elected to the college's governing body, holding numerous posts, including Chamberlain and Joint Dean of Degrees. And that's not even including all the other things I had to leave out before this introduction became longer than the presentation. So everyone, please welcome Anna Beer.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you for putting your phone on, because that makes me feel slightly better about any glitches that happen over the next 30 or 40 minutes. I spent the first paragraph of this new biography of William Shakespeare making absolutely clear just how crazy I was to say yes when I was approached to write it. I then spend the next few pages thinking about the kinds of questions that traditional archivally based biography might answer, and just how difficult that is for Shakespeare. There's so very, very little in the archive. The cupboard is truly bare. And I'm, as Nicola said, interested in the connections between literature and history, so we can go to the kind of big picture view of the right time, right place. And for William Shakespeare, it truly was on both counts. I'm extremely biased, of course, as any of my students will tell you. I kind of live and breathe the 16th and 17th centuries. But right time, right place only takes us so far. Why did this particular moment produce only one William Shakespeare? And we can answer that question with one word: genius. And if you want to think about Shakespeare as a genius, I warmly recommend you to read the work of Jonathan Bate, who's written powerfully about this, and also Stephen Greenblatt, Will in the World. But it is not my answer. So as you can tell from the start, writing a life of Shakespeare, I was doing a lot of questioning, and that in itself is a problem for some people. As Charles Dickens, an author who had quite a lot to cover up himself, actually, as Charles Dickens put it, the life of Shakespeare is a fine mystery, and I tremble every day lest something should turn up. What happens if the man we find is not merely ordinary, but unpleasant, even hateful? Now, for many years, we were sheltered from this kind of horror by a convenient biographical syllogism. And here, and I'm quoting, it's unpacked by Emma Smith, also of this parish, and author of This is Shakespeare, another book I really warmly recommend to you. It came out last year, not last year, 2019. Time has no meaning these days. This is Shakespeare, 2019. And she unpacked this syllogism with exemplary brevity. 1. Prospero, from The Tempest, is a good guy. 2. Shakespeare is a good guy. 3. Therefore, Prospero is Shakespeare. I was certainly brought up on that, I can tell you, when I learned about Shakespeare. But the same syllogism is far more problematic if Prospero is viewed as irascible, tyrannical, subjecting Caliban to slavery, or a distinctly unlikable, manipulative control freak. That's Emma Smith. As Smith puts it, if this Prospero is Shakespeare, we wouldn't much like Shakespeare. Now, this reluctance, even now, to countenance an unlikable Shakespeare informs and suppresses the debate over Christian, white, male Shakespeare's representation of Jewish people, of people of colour, of women. Far better to duck a discussion of the writer's opinions entirely, rather than to consider his potential anti-Semitism, racism, or misogyny. Instead, we all tend, and I myself included, to value a Shakespeare committed to balance and to dialogue. It's a kind of way of keeping speculation at bay, speculation about the man at bay. Again, another wonderful Shakespeare critic, Marjorie Garber, on my reading list for many, many years. She insists in her book, Shakespeare After All, that because the plays work contrapuntally, that's her word, and it's a lovely word, contrapuntally, it is impossible to say, open quotes, Shakespeare said, or open quotes, Shakespeare believed. And having gone into schools in recent years and spoken with students studying A-level English and written study guides, you're absolutely warned against, as a student or as somebody writing a study guide, from encouraging students to go anywhere near that. They must never say Shakespeare believed that. Never begin a sentence like that. And that's because it's all too easy, as I found, having done a lot of work on Milton as well, students will come up with things that Milton thought better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. No, Milton didn't think that. His character, Satan, did. But to come back to Marjorie Garber's impossibilities. When we say it is impossible to say that Shakespeare said or Shakespeare believed, these are, I believe, two different possibilities. We cannot say Shakespeare said or because there are no documents, no utterances from the man, other really than his literary texts. But what if Shakespeare believed? Surely Garber's Shakespeare, so wedded to contrapuntal drama, so careful to embed dialogue and balance into his plays, might just have believed in those qualities or virtues. Many of those who admire his work seem to accept this as an almost foundational fact. For many, not Garber I should add, it is a short step to arguing that because William Shakespeare gave interiority to characters who were not fully human according to the mores of his own time, people of colour, the Jew, servants, almost but not quite women. He must have understood and recognized those who were different from himself. It is a short step, and this time Garber makes it, to seeing Shakespeare as every man and every woman in his plays. Shakespeare is Prospero, Caliban, Ariel, and the Wandering Miranda. He is Othello, Desdemona, and Iago, Shylock, Portia, and Antonio. No one voice is definitively right. All are in dialogue with each other. All are Shakespeare. And this, over the centuries, has offered the door to far more radical understandings of his plays, and I certainly don't want to dismiss it as an approach. Generations of readers and playgoers, many of them cultural others, have experienced the powerful and pleasurable perception that in Shakespeare they are indeed represented. Witness Maya Angelou's famous declaration, "I know that William Shakespeare was a Black woman." It's a powerful and it's a liberating way to sidestep conventional biographical understandings of authorship. But it also, for me, sidesteps the tough questions I was hired to answer. Was Shakespeare racist? Is Othello the play racist? Are those questions related? What to do? I, of course, what else could I do, turned like everyone else to the plays and the poems. They are what we have, and I believe they do offer us answers, although not necessarily to traditional biographical questions. More importantly, they offer questions, which is one of the reasons they're so powerful. I'm going to focus now on Shakespeare's sonnets, because although scholars give dire warnings about the drama of the time, writers do not indulge in confessional disclosure of the self in plays. Drama is rhetorical, not autobiographical. Those health warnings, so literary health warnings, are slightly less insistent when it comes to poetry, and especially when it comes to sonnets, because it's a genre that plays with representation of self. Some of you will know what I think is the greatest sonnet sequence of the era, Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, which is on one level a self-portrait, if a very sophisticated, witty, elusive one. Sidney makes it easy to identify the object of his desire, Stella. She's known as Stella in the sequence. She is Penelope, Lady Rich, as numerous, slightly tiresome puns make abundantly clear. But at the same time, Sidney warns the reader that to make direct parallels between author and speaker would be crass. I am not I. Pity the tale of me, says Astrophil. So there's a built-in ambivalence to the form. Shakespeare's sonnets seem to offer a direct line to Will, but do they? And I can't resist this, should we pick up the phone? So I'm going to start, it's a talk in two parts. First, that was throat clear. The first is to think about the sonnets in the year 1598. William Shakespeare, playwright, was doing well. So well that a quarto volume of Love's Labour's Lost advertised itself as by W. Shakespeare, although not so well as all that, since his hugely popular Rich III, also published that year, remained anonymous. And 1598 is also the year in which this text, on your screen, was published by Francis Mears, and it praises in the bottom left-hand corner Shakespeare in print. The sweet, witty soul of Ovid lives in mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. Witness his Venus and Adonis, his Lucrece, his sugared sonnets amongst his private friends, etc. Now, this tells us at least two things. One, that in 1598, Shakespeare is better known as a poet. Venus and Adonis was 1593, Rape of Lucrece was 1594. Was better known as a poet, and those two poems that had dedications to the Earl of Southampton, more of him in a moment. So he's better known as a poet than as a playwright, at least in terms of the writing about him. Secondly, it shows us that at least some, and probably the majority, of his sonnets were written in the 1590s, were circulating in the 1590s, i.e. at the beginning of William Shakespeare's career as a writer. What do we do with this evidence, as it were, of William Shakespeare in the 1590s then? Well, I mentioned those health warnings. They come even thicker and even faster when it comes to the sonnets. With few exceptions, those who write about his life continue to obsess over a handful of issues that have little to do with what or how he wrote, from his sexual inclinations to his pursuit of status to his decision to leave his wife a second best bed. That's telling me, because I am now going to talk about Shakespeare's sexual inclinations. The thing is, the content of many of the sonnets is sexually explicit, which does not exactly dissuade the reader from asking questions about their author's sexual inclinations. And as I've mentioned, the genre itself is notorious for the way it plays with autobiographical readings. Take this extremely famous sonnet, Sonnet 20, which begins, "A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, the master mistress of my passion," generally understood to be addressed to a very beautiful young man. Now, I will leave that up there. I'm not going to spell out what's going on in here, but we are reading a poem about male genitals and what the speaker might or might not do to them. With them, sorry. The poem is both a sophisticated literary game and a somewhat gauche exploration, contrivedly gauche exploration of frustrated male desire. As the scholar and indeed editor of the sonnets, John Kerrigan, puts it, although the poem can hardly prove Shakespeare homosexual, it cannot be invoked, as it often is, to demonstrate his unwavering heterosexuality. I'll just read the last few lines. "And by addition, me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure." But needless to say, people have tried to keep Shakespeare straight. In the 18th century, sonnets 92 to 95 it was decided that they were addressed to Shakespeare's beautiful wife on some suspicion of her infidelity. The reading, characterizing Shakespeare as a jealous husband, entered the critical mainstream, surviving despite individuals' readers' understanding that the sonnets in question were addressed to a beautiful, unfaithful man. Now, every age finds the Shakespeare it is looking for in his sonnets. So we now see him no longer as a jealous husband, but as a man in conflict with his era's insistence, for example, on sex in the service of reproduction, or an era insisting on marriage as the best form of human relations between men and women. A man grappling with his era's understanding of desire as sin. Increasingly, there are people who are just going straight for it and characterizing Shakespeare and his work as queer, as a man whose desires cut across the lines of gender and sexual identities against contemporary expectations. Shakespeare is queer because his language is queer. That's a quote from Stanivukovic. Or Catherine Duncan-Jones of Oxford University argues less brazenly perhaps, but I think astutely, that Shakespeare is preoccupied with transgressive desire, with sexual relationships with well-born young men, and conversely found sexual relations with women more functional than sentimental. Or not. And I could give you lots of examples of people who are going from the other side. Shakespeare was highly heterosexual. He could imagine homoerotic feeling, but did not experience himself. The sonnets are imaginings. He had an emotional but not a physical attachment to the Earl of Southampton. That his profound homosexual attachment is almost unrealized, is just registered in the sonnets. That is the Earl of Southampton, the young man to whom the narrative poems Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece are dedicated. The one who Shakespeare is supposed to, perhaps, maybe in the further recesses of mind and quickly put the lid on, have an attraction towards. And that portrait, as some of you will know, was for many years thought to be of a young woman. So it's profound, it's now definitely the Earl of Southampton, who was a man, and it's a profoundly ambivalent, androgynous picture. The slightly desperate heteronormativity at work here, I think, says more about critics than it does about the sonnet's exploration of male-male love and sex. We cannot know what sexual acts William Shakespeare enjoyed, nor what he believed and felt about those acts. But I think we can, and probably should, say something about his choice of topic. Now, homoerotic writing was more prevalent in the era than you might think. Certainly when I was coming up through the academic system, we didn't go anywhere near any of this stuff. But even so, it's quite a brave thing to do, because he's writing in an era in which the terminology, and I quote, of buggery, sodomitical grossness, and ingling muddled various acts between men hopelessly. The key point, same-sex desire, was viciously punished, even by death, at the time that Shakespeare was writing. Therefore, for all their ironies and enigmas, the sonnets are doing something remarkable. They're offering a language to talk about love for a man. And I'm not talking about just a ramped up version of male-male friendship. Most of Shakespeare's contemporaries were perfectly content to compare favorably the comradely love between men to the shallowness of desire for women, shallowness of desire of men for women, to celebrate friendship between men. Here's Ficino in full Neoplatonic flow. The youth enjoys the beauty of the man with his intellect. It is a wonderful exchange, virtuous, useful, and pleasant to both. Ficino is saying, no sex, please, we're humanists. Shakespeare is saying something very different. However, what he's saying is harder to pin down. I mentioned he was being brave. There's a particular way in which he's being brave, because the writers who did write about same-sex love often positioned, because they had this convenient Greek and Roman tradition to work within, of the pastoral idyll of shepherds with their flocks, which was a homoerotic idyll. They had that. They could place it all sufficiently, in the far distant Latin or Greek past. Shakespeare's lovers do not exist in some safely pastoral fictional landscape. They exist here and now. And in a way, this is what makes the poems such painful reading. There is no chance for this love to be consummated in Elizabethan London, rather than, say, the Sicilian sunshine. Obliqueness, ambiguity, near impossibility. But at least there is something to celebrate, to explore. As I say, he gives a language to the possibility, almost impossibility, of love between men, possibly even of sex between men. It's all very different in the sonnets which describe sex with a woman. In fact, we might be longing for a bit of ambiguity. Again, I won't read all of this, but I'll leave it up there. Just the final couple of lines. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. And that hell is the woman's body, and specifically sex with a woman. In a sonnet sequence which can be tantalizingly enigmatic, some things are straightforward, discussed with the female body and with the sexual act with women. very happy to take questions, if anybody has one, about the Dark Lady, often the label given to the woman addressed in these sonnets. She actually doesn't have a name. Nobody in this sonnet sequence has a name, and I'll get on to why that might be significant in a moment. The woman is simply and literally an object of Will, the speaker's admittedly despised desire. His flesh, rising at thy name, doth point out thee. Yes, that is as rude as you think it is. By sonnet 144, Will's two loves are demarcated as a better angel, the young man, and a worser spirit, a woman coloured ill. Hell is her genitals, drawing in both Will and the young man. Desire for a woman is merely a sickness or a disease, generating only self-deception. For I have sworn thee fair, and thought thee bright, who art as black as hell, as dark as night. I struggle, to be blunt, with the misogyny of the sonnets. Is it a product of Shakespeare's attempt to be heard in what we have characterised as a homosocial world, what we might call locker room, or used to call locker room banter? Again, Catherine Duncan-Jones has argued something like this. This is an ambitious Shakespeare looking for upwardly mobile male friendship. And that's where his emotions are invested. He's showing off for the boys, running with the lads. But ambition doesn't still quite explain the intensity. I think we have to admit either that Shakespeare subscribed to his era's misogyny, he's of his time, or that at least in the sonnets, he was not interested in questioning it. And if it was ambition, if he's writing like this in order to run with the lads, to get himself a position, to get attention, if circulating these sugared sonnets, there's not much sugar in the sonnet in front of you, but in circulating these sugared sonnets in manuscript in the 1590s, if he's looking for patronage from Southampton, maybe from another noble, then either he was thwarted or he walked away. And that is $1 million question. Either he was thwarted or he walked away. Patronage was not forthcoming. And whether he was pushed or whether he jumped, Shakespeare chose to leave the world of coterie poetry and, thankfully for us, concentrated on playwriting. I can't help but put in an anecdote from the time which suggests that class, as much as anything else, might have meant his decision pushed Shakespeare towards concentrating on working in the theatre. Poet Shakespeare is the butt of an entertainment at St John's College, Cambridge. I believe Cambridge is a university. He may write sweet verse, but the university wit's verdict is that he's fundamentally a talented crowd pleaser who has not yet made his mark as a major writer. Ouch. And in fact, we wouldn't even know about the sonnets unless this had happened. Someone did this. I say someone because for many years it was accepted that, or believed that Shakespeare himself had nothing to do with the publication of Shakespeare's sonnets, never before imprinted in 1609. Scholars pointed to the fact that only about half of Shakespeare's plays were published during his lifetime. They point to the relative scrappiness of the printing of the sonnets, as opposed to the really high quality job done on Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece some 15 years earlier. And we also need to remember that Shakespeare didn't need to be involved. This is a pre-copyright era, completely different conditions of publication. I quite like the argument made recently that it was Shakespeare's theatre company who were behind this publication, and that of the last two Shakespeare plays to be published Troilus and Pericles, because both title pages for Troilus and Pericles mention performance at the Globe. It's kind of a PR effort for the Globe. And you've got Shakespeare up there. He's got an exploitable name, but it could be a good way for the King's men to keep their profile high during a period when, like now, the theatres were closed because of plague. So Shakespeare, as ever, we don't know where he is. We can't see him through this, in this front page, even though his name is on it. Shakespeare remains elusive. Even more elusive, is the identity of Master W.H, the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, to whom the volume is dedicated. We don't even know whether those words are the printer's dedication or Shakespeare's. We don't know, and this is interesting, whether those words belong to the literary politics of the 1590s, when most of the poems were written, as I've just been saying, or to 1609, the volume's date of publication. And again, I'm very happy to take questions about W.H, though, funnily enough, I don't have any certain answers. This is how we know about the sonnets. I want to come back round to thinking about how and whether and why we read from the text to the life and from the life back to the text. If the story the sonnets tell is not a fiction, if the sonnets operate in any way as self-disclosure, if they reveal their author, then it is not a man some people want to know. William Shakespeare may have written very famously that with this key, Shakespeare unlocked his heart. But he also denounced the poems as abominably harsh, obscure, and worthless. It's always a good reminder that Shakespeare has not always stood in such high esteem as he is now. There are more subtle ways this happens. We're not quite sure we want to know the Shakespeare that we see in the sonnets. We're still making the necessary shifts, particularly about the representations of love for a man. So we are reassured that all Shakespeare is doing, at least in 1609, is responding to a, and I quote, newly bisexualized court. That's James I is the king since 1603. James I liked men. Again, it's a political gesture. In other words, Shakespeare becomes strategically bi. And once again, we are reassured that real experiences with real people may have generated the poems. Maybe he did have a brief encounter with the Earl of Southampton in the 1590s, but the story he builds around that experience is fiction. Rhetorical projection. But even those who are arguing that rhetorical projection, this is a fiction, they are troubled by the presence of a first-person will, to the extent of setting him completely to one side. This is Kerrigan again, who's, as I say, a marvellous editor. If the bawdy quibbles on will are set aside as the fruits of an obsession, the poet's name never appears in his book. I'm not sure that we can or should set aside the bawdy quibbles on will. We're looking here at Shakespeare's sonnets, not Astrophil and Stella, or the affectionate shepherd, or Delia, or the names given to all the other sonnet sequences of the time. The reader is being offered Shakespeare on a literary plate. We have will in overplus. I love these first two lines. Whoever hath her wish, thou hast thy will, and will to boot, and will in overplus. There are some deep Shakespearean ironies at work here. Here is a poet who hopes, in some of his most moving poems, who hopes in verse that his verse will give him and the man he loves posterity. But the most obvious way to do that would be to build his name into the sequence, which he kind of does here. But it would also make sense to name the male object of his desire or love. And Shakespeare, as we've seen, does not do that. It's the more perplexing because the poems say that's what he wants to do. My love shall in my verse ever live young. My love shall in my verse ever live young. Your name from hence immortal shall have. For some reason, Shakespeare remains uninterested in naming or shaming or celebrating identifiable individuals. And this might be his most subtle sleight of sonneteering hand. My love can mean at least two things. The object of affection, you are my love, and crucially, the speaker's own love, my love for you. It is Shakespeare, the poet's love, that will live forever, his art that is immortalized, not necessarily the nameless beloved. It is the object. If it is the object of his affection, then the lack of name allows the man and the woman to become all objects of desire. In other words, his fictional characters have an extraordinary power over us still now, because of their anonymity. My closing words will be about the publication in 1609, because in the introduction it was mentioned that I'm really interested in Shakespeare's career, as it were, as a professional writer. Let's go back to the publication in 1609. As a biographer, because I have to make a call on this, my second best guess, I mentioned my first, which is that I think the theatre company might have been behind the publication in 1609. My second best guess was that Shakespeare was digging out old work because the theatres were closed, and perhaps half-heartedly making a bid for aristocratic patronage. If so, he was about as successful as he'd been back in the 1590s with the Earl of Southampton. That is not very. But at least back then, Venus and Adonis had sold a lot of copies, did very well. The Rape of Lucrece had sold a fair number of copies. But Shakespeare's sonnets didn't even do well with the reading public. It's yet another reminder that Shakespeare, although well established as a playwright, was not the literary superstar he would become. Writing about the 1608 publication of the quarto edition of King Lear, Peter Blayney observes that identification of Shakespeare as its author on the title page might have read differently to its first purchasers than it does to us. He suggests that although we might like to imagine the delighted book-buying public flocking eagerly to the shops to buy the latest masterwork from the pen of their favourite playwright, we would be entirely wrong to do so. Most of Shakespeare's plays had a relatively undistinguished publishing history before 1623. The reality is that the 1609 edition of Shakespeare's Sonnets was the only one to appear in Shakespeare's lifetime. And there was so little interest that an edition of 1640 could claim it was the first. The poems didn't even make it into the 1623 folio, whereas Ben Jonson put his poetry and his drama into his complete works of 1616. We, and I quote, like the emotional turmoil and the non-vanilla sex, that's Wargle, there is no evidence that Shakespeare's contemporaries did. Fortunately for Shakespeare's career, the playhouses reopened. I say that feelingly this year. And the rest is, if not history, then a flurry of tragicomedies and histories with a dash of magic realism, more plays, more collaborations, more grandchildren, return to Stratford, death in 1616. The sonnets of 1609 pretty much sank without trace. Only 13 copies survived. 13. Now, you might be surprised, having listened to my feminist, skeptical reassessment of some aspects of bardolatry, to hear that I'm truly grateful for those 13 copies. For the sonnets, some of them at least, are very, very dear to me. Particular lines and phrases come to mind almost every day, and if you know the sonnets and you love them, I expect the same has happened to you. I love teaching Shakespeare, the writer most able to give people, all of us, the words we need to express ourselves. I will leave this poem up here, which is very, very special to me. I read it at my husband's funeral, because who cares whether this is a poem from a man to a woman? Who cares what kind of Christian faith is present or denied? It's a powerful and astonishingly clever and beautifully constructed, once one stops crying, poem about what it means to love. Happily, I think on thee, and then my state, liked the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. So I'm grateful that even if the man himself is always just out of reach, his words are always there for us. Make of them what we will. Thank you. I'm putting up because my lovely publishers are giving discounts on the book, which comes out for pre-order, as Nicola mentioned, at the end of this month. You're very, very welcome if you go onto the Wiley Blackwell website to use that code and save 20% if you still want to buy it. Whoops.
All right, well, thank you so much, Anna. That was amazing. I confess myself to have been very interested in this talk. I've read a couple of biographies of Shakespeare, and I've always found it fascinating how little we actually know, and how much we attempt to infer from his writing. So it was fascinating to hear that from you. So thank you very much for sharing. Does anyone have any questions for Anna at all? You can raise your hand, or you can pop it in the chat box if you're a bit shy. But please do feel free. Questions, comments, thoughts, anything at all.
I should try and put up that thing again of the code, just in case anybody wants it. This is where it all goes terribly, terribly wrong. I hope that's right. Nope. I need to go back to the beginning, that's why. Aha. Okay. Oh well. I'll put it in the chat thingy if I can get myself organized. Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries. This has been a talk with technical issues.
Yeah.
But that's all right.
Yeah. That is exactly it. Very clever. Whoever calling welcomes, thank you. Well, thank you for everybody for their thanks. I did carefully leave time for questions. All my cuts are here. So yeah. One of the things I flagged up as I was going along is that this idea of the identities of the characters, and I was surprised to find, when I was trying to look at this in detail, is that the Dark Lady is never called the Dark Lady by Shakespeare. It's entirely a kind of much later label that people use, and I find that interesting, that we're desperate to kind of make it almost a soap opera and use kind of a shorthand for characters who are in some ways much more elusive than simply that. And I came across that because I was doing a lot of work on Emilia Lanya, who was one of the contenders for being Shakespeare's Dark Lady, his mistress, what have you. So, yes, right. Okay, I've got a question here. What convinces you that the poem about lust is about heterosexual love rather than just any experience of lust? I think going back to that, oops, I'll get my quote always. It depends which poem about lust you're talking about, but the one which begins, whoever hath her wish, thou hast thy will, and will to boot, and will in overplus, actually uses her feminine pronoun in the first line. So it's making explicit that it's, in this poem at least, it's talking about heterosexual. I could be more explicit, but there's some imagery that plays around with that idea. I should actually say that in my, goodness me, I know it's breakfast time for some of you and maybe far too early in the morning, but in my journey through these sonnets, my goodness, there are some very strange moments when you realize how many words that I was taught at school have thoroughly obscene meanings. Helen Vendler's edition, she sounds very proper, but she is superb at glossing some of the more tricky bits. But perhaps you were referring to Sonnet 129, the expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action. And I think looking at that one, yes, absolutely right. It could be simply a denunciation of the sexual act with anybody as something that destroys people. And I've read somewhere that, you know, there's this idea that every sexual emission for a man took 5 minutes of your life. It was like smoking a cigarette. So the expense of spirit is you lose some of your life force, you lose quite literally your semen. The thing is that other scholars would point to the word waste and see that as specifically gendered female, but I'm not an expert on this. So go to your 14 or 15 different editions of Shakespeare Sonnets that I'm sure are on your shelves and look at the debate there. Oh, I've got loads more questions. Sorry, let me be more quick in my answers. Thank you. Shakespeare Apocrypha was a play broker. I definitely think Shakespeare, I mean, I know Shakespeare was a collaborator. And I'm never quite convinced by the idea that people look at plays which are collaborations and say the good bits are by Shakespeare and the rubbish bits are by everybody else. I think Shakespeare had off days. But having said that, we are not going to know because of the sheer nature of the way in which drama was produced at the time, and indeed poetry was produced at the time. Authorship as we know it, single authorship as we know it, just doesn't work in the same way in the 1580s, 90s and 1610s when Shakespeare is working. And it's very, very difficult. And I think sometimes pointless to point to one individual as the lone author. There's so much collaboration, there's so much reciprocity, there's so much exchange, there's so much sharing of work, and it changes in I'm going to give one example, which is when we're talking about Hamlet, which Hamlet are we talking about? There are at least 3 editions, 3 versions circulating Shakespeare's own lifetime. So which one is the real Hamlet? People don't like, they called it the bad quarto, but it's a perfectly good play. It's just a different play from the longer, more intellectual, more introspective Hamlet that we think we know. If we can find evidence of Shakespeare's contemporaries in the sonnets, can we find traces of them in the plays too? That's a gift question for somebody who's obsessed with Sir Walter Raleigh, in that a lot of people say, particularly Love's Labour's Lost, which is, I think, the only play written by Shakespeare which didn't have a source or a series of sources to it, is a kind of not roman à clef, a drama à clef, satirizing people. And some people have said that Sir Walter Raleigh is the character Don Amado because he talks too much. And yes, I'd have to think a bit more about clear evidence. You've got the Orsino connection in Twelfth Night. There is a Italian nobleman visiting around that time. He has the name Orsino. Is Twelfth Night a tribute to him? That's another obvious go-to. Merchant of Venice is often seen as a response to the trial and execution of Lopez, the Queen Elizabeth's Portuguese doctor, and it is believed secretly Jewish, though converted to Catholicism, doctor, could be a model for Shylock. So there are places we can go, but impossible to prove. I'm going to keep going. Women did not appear on the stage in Shakespeare's theatre. Yes, well, funnily enough, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment on a later era of theatre, and I didn't realise until last week that it was actually a royal decree in the 1660s, 1660 to be precise, with the restoration of the monarchy, to say that women had to go on stage to play women's parts because the alternative was worse. I mean, it's bad putting your daughter on the stage, but it was even worse to have males impersonating women because of all the kind of gender and sexual deviation that might encourage. I find that intriguing. At the time, that was one of the reasons that those who disliked the theatre really did dislike it, this of boys dressing up as women, cross-dressing, and what effect that might have, not on the boys themselves, but on the audiences. It might make men desire men. So yes, it is queer in both senses of the word. And it also, I think, goes to the heart of something that I find fascinating about Shakespeare, is that he is so preoccupied with performance. And if always and ever a woman character is performed by a boy in his world, it forces him to think about who we are, because no individual on stage is all woman. Yeah, there's gender fluidity is built in to how the industry in which he works. I'm running out of time. Have I missed out any questions? Oh, yep, sorry. Yeah. Yes, in jokes, definitely. Goodness. And I mean, you get that in literature all the time, but particularly in the drama, I think, of the time, because it is, everybody's responding to everybody else, and to what's going on outside the theatre. I sometimes my lucky students worked through the first couple of pages of The Alchemist, which is impenetrable if you actually read it on the page. All the references to street names or to smutty jokes that are just circulating in the particular year of The Alchemist. It is so occasional, it is so topical. In fact, Shakespeare does less of that than most people, but he does mention the Elephant and Castle. But, you know, he really doesn't, he only once sets a play in London, I think Measure for Measure. I might be wrong about that. I hope I'm not. So the mean streets of London, the world outside the theatre, don't actually come onto the stage in Shakespeare very often. But sorry, I just said Measure for Measure is set in London. It's set in Vienna. I'm babbling because I'm trying to rush through too many questions. But he very rarely sets his plays in a city that looks and feels like the London that in which the actual theatre is being, the drama is being performed. So yes, definitely in jokes. Oh, I love that final question. It will be my final question. Will most readers of the age be able to be expected to pick up the dual sexual meaning of wording in many sonnets, or was it a code for a subgroup? I'm thinking Kenneth Williams. I think so. I don't think it's quite as coded as the 18th and 19th century have tried to make it for us. And on that note, I should probably stop.
All right, well, thank you so much, Anna, for coming along today and for talking about your book, and for providing to your publishers for providing a very handy discount code, which I may be taking advantage of myself. And I hope some of the viewers, the audience today, will do so as well. So yes, thank you very much for coming today, Anna, and thank you to everybody who's come and listened, yes. And to everybody who's asked questions. And yeah, thank you all. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope I'll see some of you in future sessions. Yeah, and I should just add, I'm very easy to track down via Kellogg College, which has got my contact details. And I also tweet for my sins on @AnnaRoseBeer. So always glad to talk to people in any way at all. Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.